Most people who pray have never actually prayed. I know how that sounds. Stay with me for a moment. You've knelt beside a bed. You've whispered in a hospital hallway. You've folded your hands at a funeral. You've said the words your mother taught you, the words you learned as a child, the words you repeat when the night won't end. And still, something quiet in you wonders if any of it was ever heard, if anyone was ever listening, if you were doing it right. A man named Daniel Whitaker wondered the same thing. For 53 years, he wondered, until the morning his heart stopped for 11 minutes on the floor of his own kitchen. And when he came back, he wasn't the same man. He didn't come back religious. He didn't come back preaching. He came back quiet, because he had finally learned what prayer actually is, and it was nothing like he'd been taught. Daniel Whitaker was not a spiritual man. That's the first thing you should know about him. He wasn't the kind who read devotionals at breakfast or underlined passages in a worn leather Bible. He wasn't the kind who closed his eyes when the preacher asked the congregation to bow their heads. He closed his eyes, sure, but only because that's what everyone else was doing. And he had learned somewhere around the age of 9 that appearing reverent was easier than explaining why you weren't. He grew up in a small town in eastern Tennessee, the kind of place where the church steeple was the tallest thing for 20 miles, where God was less a personal discovery than a local ordinance. You were baptized because your grandmother expected it. You prayed before dinner because your father would clear his throat if you didn't. You said grace. You said amen. You said the Lord's Prayer on Sundays with the rest of them. And then you went on living the rest of your week as though none of it had any weight at all. Daniel told me once in the long afternoon we spent on his porch that he had said the Lord's Prayer more than 10,000 times in his life before he ever meant a single word of it. 10,000 times. Think about that for a moment. The mouth moving, the sound coming out, the meaning sliding past like water past a stone. He became a contractor. He built homes, good ones, honest ones, the kind with square corners and doors that still closed right 20 years later. He married a woman named Ruth when he was 26, and together they raised 2 children in a house he had built with his own hands on a quiet road just outside of Johnson City. He was, by every outward measure, a decent man. He paid his taxes, he kept his word, he showed up at his daughter's recitals and his son's baseball games, and when his father died, he dug the hole in the family plot himself, because that was the kind of man he had been raised to be. And when Ruth was diagnosed with breast cancer at the age of 48, Daniel did what men like him do. He got up early, he drove her to appointments, he made the phone calls she was too tired to make, he held her hand through the chemotherapy, and he sat in the parking lot afterward, and he wept, quietly. So she wouldn't hear him through the windshield, and every night, for 18 months, he prayed the way he had been taught. He folded his hands, he bowed his head, he said the words, "Please, God, please, please, if you are there, please let her live. Please don't take her from me, please." Ruth died on a Tuesday in March. The dogwoods were just beginning to bloom outside their bedroom window, and something in Daniel broke that day that he would not be able to name for another 5 years. It wasn't faith that broke. He would tell you later that he never really had faith to begin with, and only habit only inheritance, only the sound of words passed down from people who were themselves passing them down, from people who had not questioned them either. What broke was something older than faith. What broke was the idea that there was anyone on the other end of the line. He stopped praying after Ruth died, not in anger, not in protest. He simply let the practice fall away, the way a man lets a tool fall from his hand when he realizes it was never the right tool for the job. He went back to work. He finished the kitchen cabinets for a client in Kingsport. He helped his son move into an apartment in Nashville. He grew older and quieter. The house got emptier. The nights got longer. The space beside him in the bed stayed cold. And he told no one, that he had come to believe, in the deepest and most private chamber of his heart, that nobody had ever been listening, that all those years of folded hands and whispered pleas had been, in the end, a kind of elaborate talking to himself. He lived with that belief for 5 years, until the morning his heart stopped. It was a Thursday in October. He remembers that much. He remembers the light coming in through the kitchen window at that particular angle it only gets in the fall, when the sun sits lower in the sky and everything it touches looks a little more golden than it deserves to. He remembers the smell of coffee. He remembers standing at the counter in his socks, reading the back of a cereal box. Not because he was interested in it, but because a man who lives alone develops certain habits, certain small rituals, certain ways of keeping his hands and his eyes occupied. In the long silence of a house that used to hold 4 people and now holds only 1. He remembers reaching for the sugar, and then he remembers nothing. The paramedics would later tell his daughter that Daniel had suffered what they call a sudden cardiac arrest. Not a heart attack. That's a different thing, though most people use the words interchangeably. A heart attack is when the plumbing goes wrong. A cardiac arrest is when the electricity goes out. One moment the signal is there, keeping the whole machine running, and the next moment it isn't. And the machine stops, just like that. No warning, no pain, no time to be afraid. Daniel's heart stopped at approximately 7:42 in the morning. His neighbor, a woman named Carol, who had been bringing him casseroles ever since Ruth passed, the kind of woman who knows that grief doesn't need conversation, just company, had stopped by to drop off a tin of banana bread. She knocked, she waited, she knocked again, and then, because the door was unlocked and because something in her gut told her to, she opened it. She found him on the kitchen floor. She called 911. She did chest compressions. She had learned CPR 40 years earlier as a young nurse, and her hands remembered what her mind had long since filed away. She counted out loud the way they teach you to, pressing down on his sternum, to the rhythm of a song she couldn't quite place. The paramedics arrived 7 minutes later. They shocked him once. They shocked him twice. On the 3rd attempt, his heart caught again, like an engine turning over on a cold morning. 11 minutes. That is how long, according to the medical records, Daniel Whitaker was clinically dead on his kitchen floor. 11 minutes in which the electricity of his body had gone dark. 11 minutes in which, by every measure, modern medicine knows how to make. He was not there anymore. The body was there. The heart wasn't beating. The brain wasn't firing. And yet, when Daniel tells this part of the story, he always pauses, not for dramatic effect. He isn't that kind of man. He pauses because, even now, 7 years later, he hasn't quite found the right words, and I think part of him is afraid that if he finds them, they'll be wrong, that whatever language he chooses will flatten the thing he experienced into something smaller than it was. So he pauses, and he looks out across his yard, and then he begins, slowly, the way a man begins to describe a dream he isn't sure he's allowed to remember. He said the first thing he noticed was that there was no transition. That's the word he used, transition. He said there was no moment of falling, no tunnel, no rushing. None of the things you read about in the books. 1 second he was in his kitchen reaching for the sugar, and the next second he was somewhere else entirely. And the somewhere else felt more real than his kitchen had ever felt. Like I'd been half asleep my whole life, he told me, and something finally woke me up. He said he wasn't afraid. That surprised him later. He was a man who had been afraid of a lot of things in his life. Afraid of losing Ruth, afraid of the hospital bills, afraid of growing old alone in a house that still smelled like her perfume in the closet. But in that place, wherever it was, fear simply did not exist. It wasn't that he had overcome it. It was that there was nothing there for fear to attach itself to. The feeling was clean. The feeling was whole. And then he became aware that he was not alone. He couldn't tell me what the presence looked like. Not because he didn't want to, because, he said, it didn't have a shape the way things have shapes down here. It wasn't a man, it wasn't a woman, it wasn't a light exactly, though there was light. It wasn't an angel, at least not the kind you see in paintings with wings and robes and solemn faces. It was simply a presence, a someone, and the moment Daniel became aware of it, he understood something he had never understood in 53 years of sitting in pews and mumbling through hymnals. He understood that he was known. That's the word he used, known. Not observed, not watched, not evaluated. Known. The way you know the house you grew up in, the way you know the face of your own child, the way you know the particular weight of your own hand when you lift it in the dark. The presence, whatever it was, knew him. The way you know something that has always been yours. And Daniel said that in that moment a question rose up in him. Not from his mind, because his mind in the ordinary sense was no longer operating. The question rose up from somewhere deeper, from whatever part of a man remains when the body has been unplugged and the brain has gone quiet. And the question was this: did you hear me? All those years, all those prayers, Ruth in the hospital bed, the parking lot tears, the 10,000 Lord's prayers, the folded hands, the whispered pleases, the nights he had lain awake speaking into the ceiling and received, he thought, nothing in return. Did you hear me? And the presence, and this is the part Daniel says he will never forget, not if he lives to be 100, the presence did not answer with words. It answered by showing him. It showed him every single prayer he had ever prayed, not as a list, not as a memory. It showed them to him the way you might show someone a room full of letters they had written and never sent, except the letters had all been received, every one of them. The childhood prayers he had mumbled without meaning, the teenage prayers he had whispered in the back of his truck after his first heartbreak, the prayers he had not even known were prayers, the sigh he had breathed when his daughter was born, the tightness in his chest when he watched his father lowered into the ground, the single word please that had escaped him in the parking lot of the oncologist's office when the nurse wouldn't meet his eyes, all of it, everyone, received. Daniel said he began to weep, though he had no body to weep with and no eyes to produce tears. Something in him that was deeper than weeping began to pour out of him, because he understood in that moment that he had been wrong about the most important thing a man can be wrong about. He had thought that prayer was a transaction. He had thought you folded your hands and you spoke into the silence, and if you were lucky or worthy or loud enough, something on the other end would grant your request. And if it didn't, if Ruth died anyway, if the cancer won anyway, if the world kept turning without mercy, then you had to conclude one of two things. Either no one was listening or whoever was listening did not care. That was the framework. That was the deal he thought he had been making all his life. But in that place, wherever it was, Daniel understood that the framework had never been real. Not once, not for a single one of those 10,000 prayers. Prayer, he said, and he struggled when he tried to explain this to me, because the words down here are not built for what he was trying to describe. Prayer had never been a transaction at all. Prayer had been a room he was already standing in. He had just never known the lights were on. He had spent his entire life believing he was shouting into an empty house, and the truth was that the house had never been empty, not for a single second. The truth was that he had been sitting in the lap of the one he thought he was calling out to the whole time, and the calling out itself had been a kind of not noticing, a kind of forgetting what was already closer to him than his own breath. And then the presence said something to him. Not in English, not in any language at all. It was more like a transmission. That's the closest word Daniel could find. The presence didn't speak to him in sentences the way you and I are speaking right now. It placed something inside him, the way a man might place a folded letter in the palm of someone he loves and close their fingers around it without a word. Whole meanings arrived at once, not line by line, but all together. The way you understand a face the instant you see it, before you've named a single feature. And what arrived in him was this. You were never talking to me, you were talking to yourself about me. Daniel told me he sat with that sentence for a long time after he came back, weeks, months. He turned it over and over in his mind the way a man turns a stone in his hand, trying to see it from every angle. Because at first, it sounded almost like an accusation. You were never talking to me. It sounded like the thing he had been afraid of his whole life, that no one had been on the other end, that all those prayers had fallen into empty air, that his mother and his grandmother and every preacher he had ever half listened to had been wrong about the single most important thing. But that wasn't what the presence had meant. What the presence had meant, and this took Daniel a long time to find words for, was that prayer, the real thing. The thing underneath the thing had never been about reaching someone far away. Prayer had been about turning towards someone who was already there. The words had never been the point. The folded hands had never been the point. The kneeling, the bowing, the please, please, please. None of it had ever been the point. Those were just the small rituals a frightened man used to remember for a moment or two what he spent the rest of his life forgetting. What he spent the rest of his life forgetting was that he was not alone in his own chest. Daniel said he understood in that place that every human being walks around with a second presence inside them, not separate from them, not above them, not watching them from somewhere in the sky. Closer than that, closer than a man can stand to think about for very long. Because if he thought about it too honestly, he would have to change the way he lived. And most of what we call prayer, the presence showed him, was actually a way of not noticing that closeness, a way of keeping it at arm's length, a way of pretending the holy thing was somewhere up there, somewhere out there, somewhere far enough away that it couldn't see into the places in us we have not yet forgiven ourselves for. This is the part that Daniel says people don't want to hear, because it would be easier, wouldn't it, if prayer were a vending machine? Put in the coin, pull the lever, get the result. And if the result doesn't come, you can at least be angry. You can at least shake your fist at the sky. You can at least feel justified in your disappointment. But what Daniel came back with was stranger than that. And harder than that. He came back understanding that every single prayer he had ever prayed for Ruth had been heard, everyone, and that the hearing had not been the point. The hearing had been assumed. The hearing had been the ground underneath his feet the whole time he was complaining about the sky. What his prayers had been for, what they had always been for, without him knowing it, was him. They had been for his own heart. They had been the sound of a man slowly, clumsily, across decades, learning how to turn his face towards something he could not name. Ruth had died anyway. That part was true. That part he could not pretend away. But Daniel said that in that place, for a long moment, or what felt like a long moment, though time did not work the way it works here, he was allowed to understand that Ruth was not lost, not in the way he had thought, not in the way a man thinks he has lost something when he can no longer touch it with his hands. He did not see her. He wants me to be clear about that. He did not have a conversation with her the way some people report in these stories. He did not walk through a meadow with her and say goodbye. What he was given was simpler and somehow more. He was given the knowing that she was all right. That knowing, Daniel told me, was not a small thing. It was not a pat on the shoulder. It was not a voice saying, "Don't worry. She's in a better place," the kind of thing people say at funerals because they don't know what else to say, the kind of thing that sounds hollow even when it's meant with love. It was a knowing the way you know the sun is up without having to look at it, the way a man knows his own name, the way you know, in the deepest part of yourself, that water is wet and fire is hot and the people you love are real. Ruth was all right and more than that, and this is the part Daniel still has trouble saying without his voice going quiet. He understood that she had been all right the whole time, even in the hospital, even in the hard nights when he had watched her suffer and had not known how to make it stop. Even in the last hours, when her breathing had gone thin and her hand had gone cold in his, even then, especially then, there had been something present in that hospital room that he had not been able to see. He said he wept again in that place, though he had no eyes to weep with. He wept for all the nights he had spent believing she had been alone. He wept for all the years he had spent carrying the weight of her death as though it had been a punishment, as though the universe had taken something from him because he had not prayed hard enough or loud enough or correctly enough. He wept for the version of himself that had stopped praying after the funeral because he had believed in his grief that there was no one to pray to, and the presence, whatever it was, let him weep. It did not rush him, it did not explain anything to him, it did not try to fix what it was showing him. It simply stayed with him, the way a good friend stays with you in the dark hours, not offering answers, just offering the fact of its presence. And Daniel said that was when he understood the second thing. The first thing had been about prayer. That prayer was not what he had thought it was. The second thing was about silence. He said that all his life he had thought of silence as the absence of something. The silence after Ruth stopped breathing. The silence of the house after the children moved out. The silence of God, as he had once called it in his bitterest moments. The silence that had felt to him like proof that no one was home. But in that place, silence was not an absence at all. Silence was a presence that had not yet chosen to speak. That's the closest he could come to it. Silence, he said, was the room the voice came from. It was not the opposite of hearing, it was the condition that made hearing possible. And all the times in his life he had felt abandoned by the silence, all the times he had sat by Ruth's hospital bed and strained his ears for some word, some sign, some confirmation that he was not alone, he had been missing the point entirely. The silence was the answer. The silence had been the answer the whole time, because what he had been asking for underneath the words was, "Are you there?" And every time he had stopped speaking long enough to listen, even for a second, even for half a breath, the answer had been waiting for him. Not in a voice, not in a sign, in the silence itself. In the strange, full, living silence that was not empty at all, but was instead the very thing he had been looking for, if only he had known how to look. Daniel said he thought about all the religious people he had known in his life, the ones who talked the loudest, the ones who quoted scripture in every conversation, the ones who filled every silence with another prayer, another hymn, another word. And he said he understood in that place why so many of them seemed so tired, why so many of them seemed to be working so hard. They were working hard because they had confused noise for nearness. They had learned somewhere along the way that if they just kept speaking, if they just kept filling the air with the sounds of reverence, they would not have to face the thing that frightened them the most, which was not God's absence, which was in fact God's presence, a presence so near, so intimate, so undeniably inside their own chest that it would require them to become honest in a way they had not yet agreed to become. Because that is what Daniel came back with finally. Not a doctrine, not a new religion, not a set of instructions he could pass around to the people in his life. He came back with a single understanding that has since reorganized quietly every hour of his remaining days. Prayer, he said, is the practice of becoming honest. Not honest with God. God already knows. Honest with yourself. He said that all those years he had been folding his hands and asking for things, he had been performing for himself mostly, performing the role of a man who believed, performing the role of a husband, doing everything he could, performing the role of a son who had been raised right. And the performance, he said, had not been sinful. Exactly. It had just been a long and elaborate way of staying hidden from the one part of himself that was not hiding from anything. There is a part of every person, Daniel said, that has never once been fooled. A part that knows when you are lying, a part that knows when you are afraid, a part that knows in the quiet room behind the quiet room what you actually want, what you are actually grieving, who you have actually become. Most people spend their whole lives not speaking to that part. Most people spend their whole lives making enough noise that they never have to. And that part, Daniel said, that part that cannot be fooled, that part that knows, is the part that prayer is actually for. Not to inform God of your needs. God, he said, or whatever word you want to use for the presence he encountered, already knew, had already known, had been holding every one of his needs before he had even thought to name them. But he had not known. He had not known how angry he was about Ruth. He had not known how guilty he felt for being the one who survived. He had not known how afraid he was of dying alone in the house he had built. He had not known how badly he missed his father, who had died 20 years before Ruth, and whom he had never really grieved, but he had been too busy being the strong one at the funeral. He had not known any of it. He had walked around for decades, holding all of that inside him. And he had called himself a fine man, a decent man, a man who was doing all right, and his prayers all those years had been the sound of him trying very hard not to find out. This is the part, Daniel said, that he wishes he could tell every person he passes on the street. The old woman in the grocery store line, her lips moving quietly over her rosary. The young father in the church parking lot, his head bowed before he turns the key in the ignition. The stranger in the airport chapel, sitting in the back row, staring at nothing. He wants to tell them, you don't have to work so hard, you don't have to find the right words, you don't have to say it correctly. You don't have to earn the hearing is already happening, the hearing was always happening. What you have to do, the only thing you have ever had to do, is stop pretending for just long enough to let yourself say the true thing. And the true thing is usually not what you think it is. The true thing is rarely a request for something. The true thing is usually something underneath the request. I am lonely. I am ashamed. I do not know how to go on from here. I am angry with you, and I don't know if I'm allowed to be. I'm tired in a way I can't tell anyone about. I miss her. I miss him. I miss the person I used to be before the thing happened that made me this. Those, Daniel said, are prayers. And the folded hands, the bowed head, the heavenly fathers and the amens, those are not wrong. He doesn't want to tell anyone to stop saying them. They have their place. They have been worn smooth by 1,000 years of human grief, and there is comfort in the smoothness. He understands that now more than he did before. But he said, if that's all your prayer has been your whole life, if you have only ever spoken the inherited words and have never once spoken the true thing that lives underneath them, then there is still something waiting for you, something close, something patient, something that has been waiting a very long time. When Daniel came back, and he uses that phrase with a certain caution because he is aware how it sounds, aware that half the people who hear it will smile politely and change the subject. The first thing he noticed was the ceiling, a white ceiling, fluorescent lights, the quiet beeping of a machine somewhere near his left shoulder. A nurse's voice low saying something to someone he couldn't see, and he noticed almost immediately that he did not want to speak. It wasn't that he was unable to. His throat was dry and there was a tube taped to his nose, but he could have made sounds if he had chosen to. It was that the presence of speaking, the act of forming words, of pushing air through the vocal cords, of assembling sentences out of the rubble of what he had just experienced, felt in that moment almost vulgar, like being asked to describe a symphony using only your hands. So he lay there, and he listened. His daughter arrived from Nashville that afternoon. She cried when she saw him. She held his hand and said all the things daughters say when they have just come very close to losing the last parent they have left. And Daniel held her hand back, and he let her cry, and he did not try to tell her, not yet, what had happened to him on the kitchen floor, because he understood already that the telling would take him years. It would take him years, in fact, to say it out loud, even to himself. In the hospital bed that first night, after his daughter had gone to the hotel to get some sleep, Daniel lay in the dark and did something he had not done in 5 years. He prayed. Not the folded hands kind, not the Lord's Prayer, not the please God, if you're there kind that he had worn out during Ruth's illness. He simply lay there in the dark, in the thin hospital gown, with the IV cold in the back of his hand, and he said, not out loud, not even quite in his mind, but in that deeper place the presence had shown him. He said, I don't know what to do now. That was the whole prayer. 7 words, maybe not even that, because the words were more like a shape than a sentence, and the room stayed quiet. The machine kept beeping, a cart rolled past in the hallway, and Daniel understood, lying there, that the prayer had been answered before he had finished it. Not with a plan, not with instructions, not with a voice telling him what to do next. The answer was something quieter than that. The answer was the same presence he had encountered on the other side. Here, now, in this hospital room, in this body that had been dead 11 minutes and was alive again. The presence had not gone anywhere. The presence had not been something he had travelled to. The presence had been what he had travelled from, into this strange and heavy life, and into which he would eventually travel back. And in the meantime, which is all any of us ever have, the presence was simply here, waiting. The way a parent waits for a child who has wandered a little too far in a crowded store. Daniel said he slept that night better than he had slept in 5 years. The next morning, a chaplain came by, a young man, mid-30s, wearing a small silver cross on his lapel, the kind hospitals keep on staff for people who have just come close to the thing. He pulled up a chair. He asked Daniel gently if he would like to pray together, and Daniel, for the first time in his life, said no. He said it kindly. He thanked the young man. He told him he appreciated what he was offering, but he said no. And he watched something in the chaplain's face shift, not to offence exactly, but to a kind of professional wariness. The expression of a man who has been trained to handle the newly resurrected and has a protocol for when they decline his services. Daniel told me later that he felt sorry for the chaplain in that moment, not in a condescending way. He felt sorry for him the way you feel sorry for a man who has been given a small key and told it opens every door, when in fact it opens only one, and the room it opens into is not the room most people need. He didn't say any of that to the chaplain. He just thanked him again and let him go. And then he lay back on the pillow, and he closed his eyes. And he did not pray. Exactly. He did something else, something he was only just beginning to learn how to do. He listened. Listening, Daniel would come to understand, was the other half of the thing. He had spent his whole life thinking of prayer as speaking, as the outgoing message, as the letter you drop into the mailbox and hope somebody reads. And because of that, he had never once considered, not seriously, not in any sustained way, that there might be something coming back toward him, that the mail might go both directions, that the silence that followed his words might not be the silence of an empty room, but the silence of someone on the other side of the table, waiting for him to stop talking so that something else could be said. He started small. He had to. A man does not leave the hospital after 11 minutes of death and suddenly know how to sit quietly with the infinite. That is not how any of it works. What he did instead, in the first weeks after he came home, was sit on his back porch in the mornings with a cup of coffee. He did not open his phone. He did not turn on the television. He did not reach for the radio. He just sat there. And for the first 3 or 4 mornings, it was unbearable. He said he had not realized, until he tried to do this simple thing, how much noise he had been using his whole life to stay comfortable, how much of his waking existence had been the quiet hum of distraction, the small, steady drip of input into his ears and eyes, the background chatter he had kept running, because the alternative, the real silence, the honest silence, the silence that asked something of him, had always frightened him more than he had been willing to admit. He said the first few mornings on the porch, alone with his coffee and the birds, he wanted to crawl out of his own skin. All the things he had been not feeling for 53 years came up to the surface at once. The grief for Ruth, which he had thought he had processed, came back new and sharp, as though she had died the day before. The grief for his father, the grief for the man he had been at 25, full of certainty, who had not known yet how much life was going to cost him. The grief for his own mother, whom he had buried at 40 and had not really thought about since, because thinking about her had required a kind of tenderness he had not yet learned how to extend to himself. All of it came up in the silence, in the small space he had cleared on his back porch just by not filling it. And Daniel said, and this is the part he wants people to understand, he did not try to stop it. That was the whole discipline. That was the whole practice. He did not try to push it down. He did not try to reach for a verse or a hymn or a phrase his grandmother had once said. He just sat there and let the feelings come up, and he said, into that quiet room inside him, the honest thing, I miss her. I am still angry. I am afraid of dying, and I'm afraid of living, and I do not know which one is harder. And the presence he had encountered on the other side did not vanish just because he was back in his body. He understood that now. It had not been waiting for him in the afterlife. It had been with him the whole time. Here, in this life, in this chest, in this coffee, in this ordinary morning on an ordinary porch in eastern Tennessee. He had just never known how to be quiet enough to notice. The birds would land on the feeder. The light would move across the yard. A neighbour's dog would bark somewhere 2 streets over, and Daniel would sit there. And he would feel the feelings he had not let himself feel, and he would say the small true things he had never said, and slowly, the way a house warms up in winter after the furnace has been turned on, something would begin to settle in him, not an answer, not a voice, not a sign, a settling. That's the word he used, a settling. As though something in his bones, which had been tilted off-centre for decades, was finding its level again. He told me once that he thinks this is what the old mystics meant. The ones who had written books about contemplation and silence, the ones whose names he had seen on the spines of books at the library, but had never taken the time to open. He thinks they were trying in their clumsy human way to describe this settling, this becoming level, this slow rearrangement of a life around a presence that had been there all along. But you couldn't read your way to it. That was the thing, you had to sit on the porch. His daughter came down from Nashville one weekend, about 4 months after it had happened. She was worried about him. She had been calling more often and the calls had been shorter. And she told him later that she had been afraid he was becoming depressed, that losing his heart for 11 minutes had rattled something loose in him, that he was going quiet the way old men sometimes go quiet before they go altogether. She found him on the back porch with his coffee. She sat down beside him. She didn't say anything for a while. She had her father's patience, which was the patience of a woman who had grown up in a house where the men didn't talk much, and the talking got done anyway, underneath the words. They sat there together for maybe 20 minutes. The birds came and went, the light moved, and finally she said, softly, "Dad, what happened to you?" And Daniel knew she wasn't asking about the heart attack. She was asking about the other thing. The thing she had been sensing on the phone, in the pauses, in the way he had stopped finishing her sentences, and had started, instead, waiting for her to finish her own. He took a long time to answer, long enough that she thought maybe he wasn't going to, and then he said, and he told me. This was the first time he had tried to put any of it into words to anyone, and the words came out slower and clumsier than he would have liked. He said, "I think I spent my whole life praying wrong, honey, and I think most people do." She looked at him. She didn't laugh. She didn't argue. She just waited. And Daniel told her, in the simplest language he could find, what he had come to understand. He told her about the 10,000 Lord's prayers. He told her about the parking lot tears. He told her about the presence he had met, which he still didn't know how to name. He told her that prayer, the way he had been taught it, had been a kind of shouting across a room he thought was empty, and that the room had never been empty, and that he was only now, in his late 50s, beginning to learn how to sit down in it. His daughter was quiet for a long time after he finished, and then she said something that Daniel has not forgotten. She said, "Mom prayed like that." He turned to look at her. "At the end," his daughter said, "in the hospital the last week, I'd come into the room and she wouldn't be saying anything. She'd just be sitting up in the bed, looking out the window. And I asked her once, I said, 'Mom, are you praying?' And she said, 'Yes.' And I said, 'What are you saying?' And she said, 'Nothing. I'm not saying anything anymore. I'm just letting him be here with me.' Daniel said he had to set his coffee down because Ruth had never told him that. Ruth, who had been raised even more religious than he had, Ruth, who had folded her hands at every meal and read her devotionals every morning for 30 years, Ruth had arrived at the same place he was just now beginning to arrive at. And she had not said a word to him about it, not because she was hiding it. He understood that now. She had not said a word to him about it because the kind of thing she had found could not really be said. It could only be practiced. And she had known, maybe, that if she tried to explain it to him while he was still in the middle of his shouting, he would not have been able to hear her. She had been waiting for him to find it on his own. Daniel sat on that porch with his daughter, and he understood that his wife, the woman he had spent 18 months begging God to save, the woman he had believed he had lost, had not been lost at all. Not then. Not in the last week of her life. She had been sitting in the same silent room he was now learning to sit in. She had beaten him to it by 5 years, and when she had died, she had not gone far. She had stepped quietly out of one room and into the next. And the rooms, Daniel was beginning to understand, were not as separate as the living believed they were. There is a thinness between them, a kind of porous quality, like the skin of something you could almost press your hand through if you knew how to press gently enough. He didn't tell his daughter all of that. Not that day. Some things you say, some things you let the silence say. They sat on the porch a while longer, and then she got up and she kissed him on top of his head, the way she had done since she was a little girl, and she went inside to start dinner. If you've made it this far with me, I want to invite you to subscribe to the channel and follow us every day, and I want to say something I don't think I've said yet. Not directly. I don't know who you are. I don't know what you've lost, or what you're sitting in the middle of right now, or whose name you whisper when the house gets too quiet. But I know that if you've stayed with this story for this long, if you haven't scrolled away, if you haven't moved on to something louder, then some part of you is listening for the same thing Daniel was listening for. And I want you to know that you are not alone in that. There are more of us than you think. Quiet people in quiet kitchens who have been carrying this same question around for longer than they know how to say. Now let me take you back, because there is one more piece of Daniel's story I haven't told you yet, and it's the piece that changed, for me, the way I hear the word prayer altogether. About a year after his heart stopped, Daniel went back to the kitchen. He hadn't avoided it exactly. A man who lives alone cannot avoid his own kitchen. He had made coffee in it every morning since he came home from the hospital. He had stood at the counter, at the same spot, in the same socks, reading the back of the same kind of cereal box. Life had, in that practical way life has, resumed. But he had not stood in the exact spot. He had, without ever quite deciding to, walked around it, the way you walk around a place in the carpet where something was spilled and never quite came out. He had shifted his morning routine by 6 inches. He had reached for the coffee pot from a slightly different angle. He had not, in all those months, let his socks touch the tile where his body had lain for the 11 minutes he had been gone. And then one morning, he did. He doesn't know why that morning. He said it was nothing special. It was a Tuesday, he thinks, overcast. The light coming through the window was thin and grey. He was making coffee, and he reached for the sugar, and his foot came down, without his meaning it to, on the exact place he had fallen, and he stopped. He stood there, and something moved through him that he did not have a name for, not fear, not grief. Something older than both of those, something closer to recognition. Because he understood, standing on that square of tile in his kitchen, that this was the spot, this was the doorway, this was the exact place on the exact floor of the exact house where a man had stepped out of his body for 11 minutes and stepped back into it changed, and there was nothing marking it, no scorch mark, no dent in the linoleum, no sign that anything extraordinary had ever happened there. The tile was just tile. The kitchen was just a kitchen. The world, stubborn and unimpressed, had kept right on going, and Daniel said he understood, in that moment, something that he had been circling for a year without quite landing on. The doorway wasn't the doorway, the tile wasn't special, the kitchen wasn't special, the place he had crossed over from wasn't somewhere he had to come back to in order to find the presence again. The presence wasn't here. It wasn't there. It wasn't in the kitchen any more than it was in the hospital chapel, any more than it was in the church of his childhood with the steeple visible from 20 miles away. The doorway was in him. It had always been in him, and every single place he had ever stood in his life had been, without his knowing it, standing on it. Daniel is 60 now. His hair is almost all the way white. He still lives in the house he built with his own hands on the quiet road outside of Johnson City. His daughter visits more often than she used to. His son calls on Sunday evenings. The dogwoods still bloom outside the bedroom window every March. And every March he stands at the window for a little while and looks at them, and he does not cry the way he used to, and he does not cry either, something in between, something quieter than either. He still prays. He wants me to tell you that. Because some people, when they hear a story like his, assume he must have walked away from it all, assume he must have thrown out the old words, the old rituals, the folded hands of his childhood. He hasn't. He still says the Lord's Prayer sometimes. He still sits in the back pew at Christmas and Easter because his grandmother would have wanted him to, and because there is something in the old cadences that he does not want to lose, but the praying is different now. The praying now is mostly sitting on the porch. The praying now is mostly the long, slow noticing of a morning. The praying now is mostly him saying to the presence he cannot name but can no longer mistake for absence, the small, true thing he used to be too proud or too afraid to say. I'm tired today. I miss her. I don't know what I'm doing here exactly. Thank you for the coffee. Thank you for the light on the grass. Thank you for not going anywhere, even when I did. That's the prayer now. That's all of it. And if you had told him at 30, at 40, at 50, that this was what prayer would turn out to be, that this was what he had been circling the whole time, 10,000 Lord's prayers deep, he would not have believed you. He would have thought you were describing something much smaller than the thing he had been taught to reach for. He understands now that he had it backwards. He had been taught to reach for something enormous and far away, and the thing that was actually waiting for him the whole time was something so close and so ordinary that he had walked past it every morning of his life on his way to the coffee pot. I think about Daniel a lot. I think about him when I pass a church and hear the bells. I think about him when I see an old woman at a bus stop with her lips moving over words I can't hear. I think about him when I sit in my own kitchen, in my own socks, in whatever is left of the morning, and I try, clumsily, the way all of us try, to say the true thing instead of the inherited one. And I think about Ruth. I think about Ruth in that hospital bed, looking out the window, not saying anything anymore, letting him be here with me. I think that might be the most honest description of prayer I have ever heard. I don't know what you believe. I don't know what you were taught or what you unlearned or what you're still angry about, or what you stopped doing the day someone you loved did not come home. I'm not going to tell you what to do with any of it. I'm just going to tell you what Daniel told me. The last time I sat on his porch with him, as the light was going down behind the ridge, he said, "The door isn't where you think it is." He said, "Stop looking up. Stop looking out. Stop looking for a better word, a louder word, the right word." He said, "Sit down. Be quiet. Say the true thing. Someone is already there." If this story reached something in you tonight, if it sat you down for a moment in a way you didn't expect, I want to ask you for 3 small things. Follow the channel so you don't miss the next story we tell. Share this video with 5 people, not strangers. The 5 you thought of quietly while you were watching. You know who they are. They need to hear it too. And leave a comment, a real one, not a polite one. Tell me what Daniel's story stirred in you. Tell me what you're sitting with tonight. And tell me what story you'd like us to tell next. I'll be reading. I'll be listening.